Okay, looks like most everyone's here. Um, let's go through this change. Again, I strongly recommend if you're ever interested in this, it's in the citations there, but Solin's volume of the 2-volume set on Honolulu is probably the best, very readable discussion of change. Sort of change as a constant. And you find that a lot of the literature, even today, sort of assumes that Hawaiian society, and this is true of all of Polynesian societies, we're sort of in a case of static. And there might have been changes because individuals do things, but the general impression that you get from looking at most of the literature is that change was very, very minimal, if at all. And the society was sort of like something that was made out of latex or some of rubber or something like that. So someone might sort of stretch it, but then it always bounce back to its original shape. That's really, there's a bunch of different reasons. I mean, a bunch of different people with a bunch of different agendas all have that same argument. If you're part of the group that feels that what you had was a sort of Eden type situation that gets then destroyed by the European arrival, then it's very convenient to have this idea of sort of a static society in a state of near perfection, which then gets destroyed by the sort of bull in the china shop Europeans. If you're part of a, say, sort of conservative group, you want to have a point in time so you can say, okay, this is the way it was done, because you want to bring people back to that. So the last thing you want to have is say, well, this is what they did some of the time. That just, as you can imagine, that makes arguing that someone should do X sort of hard when you're not sure exactly where X is on this sort of linear pattern. The weird thing is, if you go back to the early accounts, i.e. the literature we were talking about before, the Hawaiian literature of the 19th century, you find that they're always talking about change. It's by the 1880s and after that people start to sort of drop this change out of the discussion. You start to have this idea of Hawaiian as a static event, and then the period of European colonization, etc., as a separate event. So sort of just keep that in mind. A lot of literature you're going to read has very different views on this, and there's not all that much of it that really discusses change as sort of normative. Solin's book is probably one of the best. Not only is it very readable, but he's looking at a very small spot. He's just looking at the area of Honolulu on this island. He did an enormous amount of research in terms of looking at absolutely everything from letters that people were sending to each other to almost anything you can find. So it's by far the most comprehensive study of a particular place. And I think in that regard, it's really interesting, because what he was looking at is the changes that occurred in that particular location from the period prior to Western contact through basically the monarchy. And it's a very balanced view, but it made a lot of people sort of unhappy, because it really sort of messed with this idea of static, sort of near perfection Hawaiian society. It's been hugely popularized since maybe, since the turn of the 20th century. So anywho's, so last time we went through this whole idea of clan, this idea of clan and lineage, clan and group, clan and place, clan ancestors. So a lot of the stuff I want to go through in terms of the traditional system, i.e. the system that was here from the time of arrival till 1600. Now we've got the foundation for that. So when you remember the concept of, I used the Samoan term ainga, this large sort of extended family group. It's always in the context that the ainga goes through time. The ainga starts at an unspecified point in the past where there is an ancestor. It goes through all the past generations of people you remember, which is what you would see in genealogy chats. And it comes into the present, with the people that are standing around you right now who are family. But it also includes the future, the generations that will be. So the Polynesian concept of family, and Hawaiian's no different, is something that goes through time. It's not in time. And this makes it very different, I'd say radically different than the American version of family, which as far as I'm concerned is totally in time. One of the creepier things I've had to do as an archaeologist in the past is twice we got involved in projects where they were in one case, the state, in the other case, I think it was, I can't remember what it was. It was some group over in the Big Island County, I guess, was having to move burial, basically cemeteries. Now, these were both historic cemeteries from the mid-late 19th century. And we spent, well, they spent, and then we on top of that spent, I think, 6 to 9 months trying to track down, in one case, about 30 folks near Mala Wharf, and another case, about 15 near Ali'i Drive in the Big Island. In most cases, we had some tombstones. We had some of the burial records, but in both cases, the entire cemeteries had been abandoned. They had wrecked cars on them. The one in Mala Wharf was covered in about 15 feet of garbage. So what had happened is somewhere along the line, people were not interested in the past members of their family. At some point, the link broke. The people that were alive that remembered those folks either couldn't get out there or whatever, and then the folks after them didn't know, or say, Grandpa was buried. What was really sort of interesting is when we contacted a fair number of these folks, and they were all local, with some of them sort of like, oh, thank you very much. And then we had, the guys that were in charge went and took these burials out where they were and reburied them in a regular modern cemetery so everyone could find them. So the main reason for moving in both cases was vandalism. People were actually stealing the tombstones and selling them. It was pretty surreal. But the key thing about all this is that when you talk to the living family members today, in one hand, they were really bothered that people were messing with their family, stealing tombstones or whatever, destroying the cemetery. On the other hand, if you ask them what did they want to do with it, or were they, if we cleaned it up, would they come and visit, take care of it? In all cases, they said no. Oh yeah, that's our great uncle, but no one remembers him anymore. So there was a disconnect. It had become a very much more of what I would call a lineage-based system, where people are based on the memory of the existing living, and that sort of defines your relationships with the past. Clans don't work that way. Clans include a continuity of the past, present, and future, irregardless of whether you remember that individual or not. So it's two very different systems. Now, in some of Europe, it's sort of lineage-based. In other parts of Europe, especially, for example, your Celtic regions and some further east, it's pretty much still clan-based. So you have to remember that you can't talk about Anglo-European concepts of lineage because there is no such thing as Anglo-European. The folks that end up in the United States are very different than their European counterparts, and the European counterparts are different from one place to another. Having said that, the mainstream population in the United States is lineage. So this is different. Key thing in this concept is everyone in Hawaii in 1400, if you want to use an arbitrary number, when you ask them who they were, what identified, like people still do in Asia, they would identify with their family's name first. I am a member of this group. And that's how they saw themselves. They saw themselves as a member of a population, a group of people in a package, if you would. And they were all there together, and they shared, and et cetera, but they were a unit. There was not the me. In fact, it's still very true in most Polynesian societies. Me or I is a, I don't know if you call it, but I don't know what part of the grammar that is, but that sort of personal identification is something you have to be very careful using, because in much of Polynesia, the more conservative areas, and this is true conservative areas here, people have a real negative reaction to the idea of me, because it's usually me in contrast to. And in traditional Polynesian societies, and you still find this a lot in Asia, the us is the thing, the group that you're a part of. Now, as I think I mentioned in passing last time, you have to remember that one of the downsides of this is because each clan sees itself as being a distinctive entity. You're descended from a shark, you're descended from the lizard goddess, you're descended from whatever. You do not have the idea of the human species as a concept you buy into necessarily. Now, you understand that there's people who are different than you that walk around, speak Hawaiian, whatever, but they're not part of your family. And the key that's part here is that you have to remember in Hawaiian society, as in the rest of, in fact, all of the Pacific, what you have is because you don't have this sense of the human species as being unique. You don't have the Judeo-Christian Islamic concept of man being made in the image of God. And of course, then you have the 10 Commandments and the other sort of rules that apply to all people all the time. But to a certain extent, they apply only to people. So if you're not a human being, if you're a donkey or a crow or something like that, then Ten Commandments don't apply to you in the sense that you're not aware and you're not of God in the same way. So therefore, those social rules are only for people. You have to remember in a Pacific Islands context, and this is true of Asian societies also, is that morality and rules only apply in the clan. So there are a very, very strict set of rules that apply to people who are part of the group you're a part of. How you interact with people, who you sit next to, a whole mess of stuff like that. I grew up in a system like that. It's incredibly rigid in terms of dealing with your relatives. Outside of that, there's almost no rules. And this is why, for example, you can get in a situation where a chief from one island here can sail to another island. The folks in the other island can, give him a good time, feed him for a couple of days, then kill him. If he's not of their clan, their morality is what we call situational. So the morality is the rules of the clan morality. There is no idea of the human species morality. So there's no Pacific Island equivalent to 10 Commandments or the Pillars of Islam. There's none of this sort of unitary package that applies to all people. It's all clan-based. So it's a very rigid set of rules in the clan. Of course, remember that also applies to whatever the animal form might be of the clan. But it doesn't apply outside of that. Doesn't mean you can't do them, but it means you're under no social obligation. You won't feel a huge amount of social pressure if you don't do them. If you understand that, then for example, the high chief's whacking cook makes sense. You give someone a situation, he, as far as you're concerned, abuses that situation, then the rules of sort of hospitality have been fulfilled, and you can do whatever you feel like, and when he gets really aggro, you just whack him. And that's entirely legit. No one was going to diss them on that because they had followed the rules of morality, which were within the group. As we'll see later, in contemporary Polynesian societies, this can cause a fair amount of trouble because on one hand, you have this Christian overlay. On the other hand, you still have this tremendous amount of loyalty and identity to a smaller group. And in many cases, the morality of behavior is still sort of more qualified around that smaller group rather than the entire package. So when you're looking at this idea of ainga and matai, this idea of the extended family and the political social relationships, it's with this idea that that's the morality system also. Now, what that meant, if you were the matai, if you were the head of the family, your morality and loyalty was to the family. And that meant to a certain extent you could play games, if we can call it that, with folks outside of the clan and not face the displeasure of the clan members, especially the elders, in terms of your behavior, because they're not one of us. So the one of us commodity was the clan. And I can't emphasize how important that is because as with a lot of stuff, it hasn't disappeared. It's still sort of around. I mean, you get this a lot when you're talking to people is the sort of us and them component isn't color-based. It isn't where you're from based. It isn't who you are based. It's what family you are based, which I think people have a really hard time grasping because it means that, among other things, the concept of stranger is radically different. If you think of sort of a classic sort of, really ancient, say Clint Eastwood or some other type of Western, some guy comes riding into a town and then, sort of everyone just sort of, the whole thing just sort of goes up and pretty soon everyone's dead. This idea of the strangers are dangerous, strangers are risky, strangers are this and that. But in a lineage-based system, almost anyone can be a stranger and almost anyone is a stranger. In a clan-based system, anyone who's a part of the clan is automatically, by definition, not a stranger. If they're part of your group, they have to follow the rules. They have to do what they're supposed to do, and there's no need to educate them. They are what they are. Outside of the clan, everyone's a stranger. And that also means there's no morality to strangers. Rules of hospitality that are so famous in Polynesia are entirely the prerogative of the family that's doing the hospitality. They can define how long, they can define whatever it is, and they're not subject to sanction if they don't follow the rules, because the rules are theirs to change as they wish. Now, one of the things that happens when these guys come up from the south in this auto cult is they switch this to another type of system. One of the things they apparently were really into sort of getting rid of or modifying, I'm not sure which, you can pick your word for it, was the ainga. They really, really, really did not see clan as a legitimate thing. And a large part of what we know of the Oro religion basically just sort of pulls clan and just sort of disintegrates clan. What they do is they replace it with a caste system, very much like a miniature version of what you'd find in some place like India. So in the Pa'au religion, when this new religion comes in, it says that this is the false old ways. Their view is that God Oro has told them the new way. The new way has people basically in three groups. Group one is the chiefs, the Ari'i. Now, the Oro folks argue that the Ari'i are actually a separate type of thing. They're a separate, if you would, species. And they use the argument of mana as their logic of that. So they argue that basically chiefs, by virtue of who they are, by virtue of their birth, this is a sociobiology thing, are basically have the ability to both generate more mana and also store more mana. So think of it as like large batteries. Now this gives them power, but it also gives them obligations. And so they're a small group of the society, but therefore this is one of the reasons in the Oro religion, chiefs had to marry chiefs. So chiefs aren't marrying in a clan. Chiefs are marrying other folks who are the same genetic component as themselves. And this is why genealogy of chiefs becomes so important. This is your proof that you're one of this particular special sort of subspecies of the human species. The majority population, which as I mentioned in Tahiti is called Manahune, gets called Maka'inana here, people of the land. And the key here is Maka'inana are the majority of your population, but in many ways they would fit the anthropological, sociological definition of a peasant. They are of the land, they live on the land, but they do not have the rights to dictate the use of the land, and they do not have rights to dictate staying on the land. That's the prerogative of the chiefs. The Maka'inana are seen as a different subspecies. They are smaller batteries, they cannot carry much mana, they cannot generate much mana, and they can't store a lot of mana. So to a certain extent, if mana makes the world work, if mana helps the rain to come when it's supposed to, if mana helps the plants grow properly, if mana helps people stay alive and not get sick, then the Maka'inana have enough to basically maintain themselves, but they don't have enough to make these other things happen. The chiefs are the only ones that can make all this other stuff happen. So what you end up is basically the Maka'inana become the holders, or should I say the Ari'i become the sponsors and protectors, if you would, of the commoners. And the commoners give the respect and authority in the decision-making to the chiefs in trade for access to mana that only the chiefs have a monopoly of. So this is the relationship of the Ari'i on one hand, the Maka'inana on the other hand. Now, if you think about it, it's totally different than this system. In the old system, a clan had a relationship to a piece of property, and the clan decides what to do with the property, et cetera, et cetera. In this new system, it totally changes. At the bottom of this level is a third group. And this is always real problematic. Solons mentions them a couple of times, and a bunch of other writings too. I'm not sure if they existed on all the islands, and I've never seen a particularly good study of them. These are usually called Kalva. There's about 3 or 4 different words for it. Kalva is the most common. This was a group of people who were seen as having basically no access to mana, to the extent that, for example, when you needed to do a sacrifice to gain someone's mana, there was absolutely no point in Ari as what you guys call the, again, remember, I think I mentioned before, I use the R or the RL sound. So yeah, it's the same. Julian was asking the pronunciation. Yeah, same. So in this situation, what you have is you have this puzzle, and this is this third group. This is a group that for some reason is seen as being not even having the capabilities to Maka'inana. Now, at least in the early historic period, the period of European visitation, there were actually Kalva settlements on the Big Island. In other words, there was communities that were all Kalva. We're not sure what that's about. We don't know, we don't have good oral traditions for them on other islands. That doesn't mean they didn't exist. This is one of the problems you get into in an oral system. If there's things you don't want to talk about, then people just don't talk about it, which means as it goes through time, it disappears. So we're not sure who these folks were. We know they didn't look any different. They were just part of the Hawaiian community, but they were completely sort of ostracized. They were sort of not quite what the Indians would consider untouchable, but they were certainly pretty close to it. So your main population is this group of folks on the land, but they have now been somewhat dispossessed from the land. And actually a good example is where I do my work in East Maui. The high chiefs on the Big Island, basically the western side, the Kona side of the Kohala side of the Big Island, go and eventually take over East Maui. So they take over what's now called Kaikinai. In that process, they pretty much eradicate the Maui chiefs. We're not even sure of a lot of the Maui chief genealogies. We're also not particularly sure of which families of Makainana lived in that part of East Maui, because it becomes very clear that they now get thrown out. So the Big Island chiefs reward some of their followers from Kohala. And they basically tell 3 families in Kohala, they literally sort of grab them and just move them lock, stock, and barrel and say, here, you guys are leaving South Kohala. You're not going to live in East Maui. And so the families like the Uoiokalanis, for example, live in East Maui. When they have family reunions, part of the family is in East Maui and part of the family is from Kohala. And that's because everyone knows from the genealogies and also just the historic records, that's where they came from. Now, the high chief had the prerogative to move Makainana where they wanted to. So you end up in a weird situation that if you're talking to East Maui and people are saying, oh, you know, we're one with the land, that's true. On the other hand, they're very aware, as, you know, if you look at the history, that they've only been there since about 1785. So this was very common. Moving people sort of arbitrarily by chiefs was a real typical proposition they got really heavily into in the 1800s. And this had nothing to do with the Europeans. This was part of this Pa'ao thing. The chiefs are a different type of thing than the Makainana. So the chiefs can, among other things, can make kapu. The chiefs can make a set of rules that the Makainana have to follow. The Makainana might like it, but they can't complain about it. That's not their prerogative. That's the prerogative of the chief to run everything. So what happens is you see then this spills over into everything else. If one of the main functions, and I would argue sort of intentionally, of this Oto religion is to sort of gut or destroy the idea of clan, then not surprisingly, one of the other big things they do is they gut the idea of clan relationship to place based on ancestors. So in your traditional system, you can argue that you should live in Kahana because that's the purview of Kamapua'u, who is your ancestor, but I went through this before. And that's the Ainga, that's the clan land. What happens is that gets replaced with chiefs. So we know in the late 1600s, early 1700s, chiefs come in and start doing this PAO system, which was probably already in place. They start moving some of the families around in Kahana. Some families get moved out, other families get moved in. And so what happens is arguing, if you go up to one of the chiefs and say, well, I can't leave because I'm Kamapua'u's kids, they're just going to look at you and say, dude, that's not relevant. I'm telling you, you get your ass out of there and you move down to Kailua. And if you don't do it, I'll kill you. So this is the new system. The new system is basically a very segregated system. Among other things, chiefs could not become commoners. And this is very much like you're familiar with the Japanese system. This is the concept of samurai, for example, versus peasants. Chiefs could be very poor and live in little houses and basically live like starving commoners. But wealthy commoners couldn't become chiefs and chiefs couldn't become commoners. They were two separate groups. They pretty much didn't interact. Chiefs were not allowed to interact with commoners except for very particular points of time. For example, certain periods of the Makahiki for about a week. And then when a high chief dies, there'd be a period of time where there was basically no rules for about a week and a half. But other than that, it was total segregation. And so it's important to remember this is this new system laid on the landscape and laid over the old system. So among other things, you lose this idea of praying to your ancestor. Your ancestor is no longer a particular place-based form that built X, Y, or Z. You now move to a system where your relationship with religion or your relationship with beliefs is based in part upon which of these social entities you are. So you end up, among other things, and I'm not sure I actually have this printed out, you end up with the concept of heiau, H-E-I-A-U. These are the Hawaiian religious sites that we see that show up in large numbers in this Pa'ao period. Prior to this, we're not sure that heiau really existed. We know they were ritual sites. We're not sure exactly how they function because we don't have a lot of clarity on that. And to be honest, when you do see clan-based ritual sites, they're oftentimes still embedded in chant because there's something where a clan ancestor did something, and clan members will still leave gifts or offerings or whatever at these clan places, but they're not part of the sort of systemic new religion, which is based on these large, in some cases very spectacular religious sites. And again, the Big Island is the biggest player in this because this new religion starts up and gains a lot of its power on the Big Island. So if you go to the City of Refuge area in South Kona, What you're looking at there is actually a whole complex that they basically took up a whole of nothing but ritual sites. If you were a commoner who was coming up from the south and you're going around that area around Ke'i and then north, you actually had to swim out to sea to go around that heiau. You were not allowed to land at that particular location. If you did, you'd be grabbed, your legs and arms would be broken, and you'd be basically stored till the next ceremony, at which point you'd be sacrificed on a loakini or pu'u kanaka, or a human sacrifice heiau. So the idea of human sacrifice becomes widespread, relatively speaking, in this system. And this idea of sacrifice becomes one of the ways that you enforce the rule and the different nature of chiefs. So this is one of the ways that the chiefs enforce kapu, is by killing those that do it, but they just don't whack them. They put them into rituals. The function of a heiau becomes a mana generator that's run by chiefs for chiefs. And you use humans along with other things like pigs or the humuhumunukunukupoa, certain types of fish that grunt, as energy, on the same way that you put gasoline in a generator. These become how you make this system work. That only chiefs could use a heiau, only chiefs could benefit from a heiau. So if a high chief, for example, I think I mentioned last time, so Kamapuaa comes to Oahu, does a huge ceremony at the huge heiau, Papaenena there in Waikiki, sacrifices some Maui chiefs, which he brought over just for that purpose. Now that does several things. One is because he did the ceremony. He ends up with the mana in him. Because he's a chief, he can then spread that over his army. Now a commoner who was standing at the ceremony would have, the Hawaiian perception is he either would have been killed by the enormous amount of mana which he cannot handle, or he would have short-circuited the entire ceremony so no one got any mana. So only chiefs were allowed on the heiau. You could turn off a heiau just like you can turn off a generator if it needed repairs, but then you would turn it back on, have a series of sacrifices, and the heiau would go back and function. Now, there were a whole mess of different types of these ritual locations. We had an agricultural heiau, for example, down here at the rifle range at the bottom of campus. That didn't use human sacrifice, but it was still run by chiefs, for chiefs. Its purpose was to make sure that the land was productive, but its other purpose was to enforce rules about access to water and land on the Maka'ainana. So there must have been a very complex relationship that people had with these ritual sites, because these ritual sites, on one hand, were seen as absolutely critical. They're the means by which you survive. They're the generators of mana. So you now have taken mana from the prerogative of the ancestor. The ancestor and family no longer give you mana. Now mana is almost entirely given to you by chiefs, and chiefs get that through ritual. And the rituals are largely at ritual sites. Now what happens, interesting enough, and again, this is true on all the islands as far as we can tell, though again, it's easier to see once you get off the Big Island, is that families still conducted the old style rituals. They just made sure they did them where no one else could see them. So in most of the Hawaiian Islands, you'd find that clans/families still did clan-based ceremonies. In many cases, still do clan-based ceremonies even in 2020. But that wasn't part of this other religion. So it'd be sort of like if you think of someplace like Ireland, you have the old Celtic belief system, and the Catholic Church comes in, and people still do the Celtic stuff and did the Celtic stuff, despite the fact the Catholic Church punished you if they found you doing it. Same thing happens here. So you have to, life here was pretty complicated. So it becomes an enormous amount of change that takes place. Now, one of the other side effects of this is in the old system, since family was the center of everything, it also means that every group was pretty much self-sufficient. There would be people who are specialists. You know, if you need a canoe made, I'm sure any ahupua'a had enough people who could make a canoe. But if you wanted a really good canoe, there were people who obviously had a better reputation. So you would, you do a deal and you give them, more stuff, and they do something for you. But in most cases, it was pretty much self-sufficiency based on the family, village, ahupua'a. So a village, for example, would consist of one or two clans that would be the members that lived in that place, not ahupua'a. In the system that replaces it, what you start to see is a really increased amount of specialization. One of the things that comes in by the 1700s, at least on the Big Island, though to a lesser extent on the other islands, is the idea that what you do when you grow up is, unless there's some obvious alternative, is that you basically take the job of your dad. Now, this is very typical of what you see in Europe right in the 17 or 1800s or a lot of the rest of the world. You inherit the job of your father. So if the father was a fisherman, you become a fisherman, and the father teaches you that. But if you decide that you want to be a farmer, then everyone's going to tell you that ain't happening. If you persist in it, the local, the konohiki or the small chief, the local chief, might come up and tell you grow up. If you persist in it, you might eventually be killed. So specialization becomes the name of the game. People grow up in the world of their fathers. They pick up their mothers. They pick up the skill set of their relatives, their older relatives, and that's what they get. So you don't see this idea of self-sufficiency. Now becomes more dispersed. Now what you see is a lot of specialization. Parts of a community only do this. Parts of a community only do that. And so you find that now you find folks that are specialized in only being fishermen. You find, and women, particular groups of women who only make tapa. You find families that specialize in chant and hula. So what you find is you start to get some increasing specialization, which was not the way it used to be, because before clan was everything. Now, because it's place and the rule of the chiefs, now the world's changed again. So notice how all this is occurring simultaneously, but it's not occurring at the same time. This starts earliest in the Big Island. So it starts in the Kona section of the Big Island segue here. So it starts here. Here's Va'aula Heiau. So this is where the folks from the south either land or set up. Well, it's certainly where they set up shop, because Va'aula has the tradition of being the place where Pa'ao lands and the place where he sets up the new religion. So it spreads from Puna across the Big Island fairly quickly. By 1550 or so, the Big Island is almost entirely embraced. And one of the reasons we know this, you just see a large number of heiau popping up. And most importantly, a large number of pu kanaka or luakini heiaus for the purpose of human sacrifice. It then spreads over to Maui and gets pretty much entrenched here, especially in this section of the really wealthy parts of Maui, which were the Lahaina side and the Wailuku side, not so much in the south. And so it becomes part and parcel of the way that they do business. It gets sort of dispersed out here. When we get into Molokai, for example, is a fascinating example of differentiation, but still some specialization. When it hits Oahu, it took some time. So there was a period of, if you would, missionizing, as the folks that are arguing this new religion are moving across the islands. And for whatever set of reasons, when they hit Oahu, the message they had, or the proof that it was the new religion was legit, wasn't quite as bought into. So you find that the number, for example, of ritual sites on Oahu, per population basis, is pretty significantly smaller. The windward side gets into it in a big way. The Waititi side gets into it in a big way. But the Waianae side, not so much. There's actually relatively few Luakini or Pu'ukanaka heiau on this side of the island compared to the population size, compared to the other islands. Now, the interesting one is when you get to Kauai Niihau, the evidence is pretty much that when you look at human sacrifice, how there's very few on Kauai, and what few there are is on the East Coast, pretty much. So what appears to have happened, and we know this because even in the 19th century, the oral traditions for Kauai Niihau, where the chiefs had significantly less power, and it was fairly common, apparently on Niihau, on the west part of Kauai, for chiefs to intermarry with certain groups of commoners. So somehow the religion that comes across the Big Island, when it hits Kauai Niihau, either people don't buy into it as much, or they modify it, who knows. But then the result is these two islands had a different view of how this all played out. Now, in a weird way, if you know anything about Hawaiian history in the historic period, this becomes part of the argument when Kamehameha tries to take over and invade the Western Islands here. He fails twice, and eventually has to do sort of a deal with the high chief on the island of Kauai. And this is one of the reasons that folks on this area will sometimes still point out to you, as far as they're concerned, they never actually were part of the monarchy. But more importantly, in some ways, they actually weren't part of this system. So when you get into the Western Islands, to a lesser extent Oahu, but certainly Kauai Niihau, you find that the relationship that people have with clans in many areas is actually somewhat stronger. the relation that people have with chiefs, the number of chiefs, the genealogy of chiefs, the places tied to chiefs is significantly less. So one of the ways that you notice this is when you look at these islands, especially the Big Island to a lesser extent Maui, you find the number of places and things that are tied to the four gods of the Oto cult. Tu, Tanaroa, Arono, and Tane are pretty much throughout this entire area. So what you're going to find is large numbers of ritual sites tied to one of the manifestations of the four gods. You get over here and you find a lot of the ritual sites are actually tied to, Hi'iaka, Lohiau, Pele, Kamapa'a, whatever. So what you find is the older system of clan ancestors still is a powerful force, which on these islands, especially on the Big Island, was pretty much, and I would argue pretty much intentionally dropped because it was in competition with this new religion, which was trying to argue that the four gods of the Oto-based logic were dominant over these. And this is why, for example, you're not going to find Heiau related to Pele or Kamapa'a and the other old ancestor gods on the Big Island. You're going to find places that are ritually important to her, Hale Mamau, for example. But you're not going to find Heiau to dance to that because you didn't do sacrifices to ancestors. You do sacrifices to the four gods, specifically, most importantly, usually Ku. So what you have in this new system is chiefs are a different type of thing than commoners. And chiefs have the power of all the aspects of the system to their advantage. And commoners pretty much put up with it. And in many cases, not to their advantage. And this becomes the reality of the 1700s in the Eastern Islands over to Oahu. Segue back to the other one. Actually, let's look at this one. Now, we can sort of see this here. Back in the early 20th century, Kekahuna was an archaeologist slash draftsman, etc., working for sort of a British Museum part of the time. I actually went around on the Big Island and recorded a bunch of Hawaiian sites when they're still sort of intact. This is sort of handy because they're actually beautifully done. They're very easy to visualize. This is a site in Kahalu. So this is part of this new religion. This is what a Hawaiian site looks like in the period of Pa'ao. You have a ritual site here. This is a heiau. And the ritual site has a set of components to it. Heiau always had a set of architectural features that made it what it was. You have house sites. That's these smaller rectangles here. And here's sort of 4 house foundations here. What you would have found, and again, this existed prior, the idea of gender segregation was common. But in the Pa'ao period, what you get is, it's important to remember that actually he calls them house sites, but they would have been actually somewhat not really houses. What they would have been is largely mua. So these would have been locations where men, Makanana men, hang out. The women would have hung out in generally not quite as nice structures, which I don't see any of them here. They usually consider them like more broken down house sites. So there was almost complete gender segregation. This is one of the things that the chiefs insisted on, is that men and women could not have contact with each other except in very specific ways. The idea that only men could eat certain food, only women could eat certain, well, there's very little that women could eat that men couldn't eat, but there's a whole mess of stuff that men could eat that women couldn't eat. So what you start to get is very specific, very sort of rigid rules of gender segregation that applied across the board to everyone, but most specifically the Makanana, and the chiefs would enforce them. And this becomes part and parcel of this system of society. That's what the Europeans describe when they arrive here. And in many cases, this becomes, for most folks, this becomes what people think when they think of classic Hawaiian society, is this Big Island version of Hawaiian society in the period after the dominance of Pa'ao, or the Pa'ao, the Areoi religion, or the Oto religion, whatever you want to call it. So this becomes traditional Hawaiian society. And this is, of course, one of the sources of confusion, is just exactly, what the hell is, tradition in terms of which one, where, why, and how. Probably the most striking of these, and this again, you see this a lot with Kamakao's ruling chiefs, which is probably the best resource to look at all this, because he's actually he actually keeps track of this. Now it's important to remember that all the guys that are writing the Hawaiian literature in the 19th century are chiefs. They're from the ranks of the elite. So they have to a certain extent, a vested interest, because the monarchy was not the monarchy of the Maka'aina. The monarchy was the monarchy of a set of these chiefs who had come to dominance in the conflicts of the 1700s with Kamapa'a, or I should say Kamehameha, coming to the fore. So what happens, in fact, this starts up, you see this according to Kamakaua, you see this about 100, 150 years prior to, say Kamehameha, is that warfare changes. And I think I mentioned this before. Warfare in the old system was basically bragging rights. So you're going to compete with other people because you want to show that your clan and your ancestors are more powerful than whoever. By the late 1600s, early 1700s, what you start to get is high chiefs and specialized military forces invading other islands or other parts of islands, landing there, destroying the food, destroying the crops, the animals, and in many cases, for example, slitting the throats of pigs rather than eating them. So you just basically desolate a place. You destroy the Hawaii, the water features, you destroy the fish ponds, you burn down the houses, and you either grab part of the population, which might be where the Kauwau come, they might have been war slaves, or you just wipe them out. And then you take over that place. Now, in the old system, of course, it didn't make any sense, because if it's another Ahupua'a, for example, the folks in Kahana, there'd be no sense in invading Kaneohe, because you're moving from Kamapua'a's property to one of the mo'o's property, Kihavahine. So why would you can't keep that property anyways. It belongs to a mo'o that built it, and she's still there. So pretty much in the old system, people pretty much stayed in their area because that was their legitimacy. In this new system, chiefs have whatever legitimacy they can get by force of arms. So if you're Kamehameha, for example, or his dad, like Kalani'u, what you do is you basically just, if you have a large enough army, you go find your neighbors, just beat the crap out of them, and you take over the property. So Kalani'u ends up in charge of almost all the Big Island. Then he goes in, for whatever reason, decides he really has a need to acquire Maui. So 3 different times he invades Maui for the sole purpose of basically taking it over. And the first 2 times he doesn't get it done. The second time, last time he finally gets the Hana part taken over. So you end up with almost 30, 40 years of warfare between the western side of the Big Island and East Maui for control of parts of Maui, which in the old system would have made absolutely no sense. But now what you've got is a very European type system. You've got high chiefs who look a lot like what you would call kings, which is one reason why the Europeans were so comfortable with the Hawaiian chiefs. If you're cook, for example, you're there because you're a British naval officer, but the head of the country technically is still, I think it's King George at the time. You still have a king, and you still see kings as being different types of things. So if you land in Hawaii and you have a high chief, because remember, he's dealing with Kalani'u, you see as someone who in many ways looks a lot like a European monarch. He controls the state, he controls the rules, he makes the rules, he has war in his neighbors, he destroys other people's property, he takes them over, he kills the guys that are running them. It looks just like home. It looks like Europe in the 1700s. But for Hawaiians, it must have been a huge shock because it wasn't Hawaii a couple of hundred years earlier. Probably the most striking in this, because they get absolutely screwed, would be these guys. And this is a classic example of this period of the 1700s. Kalani'u invades Maui. He gets his butt handed to him in Kahului. There's a huge fight in the sand dunes outside of Kahului, probably near where that big church is now, I suspect, outside of town, and gets creamed. As he's ditching, as he's leaving, he's all pissed off. A fair amount of the army is still sort of intact. So what he does is he sails over to Lanai, which was actually part of the Maui package. The Maui package included all these islands at the time. And these guys had done absolutely nothing to him. There were probably not all that many people, maybe 1,000, 2,000 people lived on the island. So he lands on this place and literally destroys it from one end to the other, and he depopulates it. We know from Kamakaua and the other accounts that there was no one living on Lanai in full time in the late 1700s after Kalani'u wipes the place off the map. He destroys the animals, destroys the agricultural system, wipes out the people or enslaves them, we're not sure which. And when he leaves, there's nothing left but a smoking, burning wreck. It sounds like Europe. It sounds like the 100 Years' War and stuff like that in Europe. You know, go and loot a city, trash it, wipe the people out, and then go look for another fight. What does he do? He then sails to Molokai and trashes most of the island also. And then when he's done all this, which serves no function, then he just packs his army up and goes sails back to the Big Island and waits for a rematch. So when he's gone, parts of Maui have been destroyed. Lanai's completely written off the map, and Molokai's been absolutely hammered. Just because a chief got pissed off because he lost a battle. You know, that's not the old system. This is the new system. It's a radically different way of doing business. And it's this system that the Europeans bump into. It's this system that oftentimes is now called traditional Hawaiian society. And it's this system that makes the monarchy. The monarchy is a result of this system. And this is one thing that's really important to understand when we get into the historic period. The monarchy was a result of chiefs from this part of the Big Island who are all part of an inter-family system. But they're also very good at killing each other. You have to remember that Kamehameha comes to power by killing his half-brother, which he shed not a tear over particularly. So it was just, it was very European in many ways. It was, family fratricide was a real common product. And so what you do is you basically whack your relatives, you whack anyone else who's opposing you, you then take over the island, take over the other islands, and you become, quote, the first king of the Hawaiian Islands. So it's a very 17th century or 18th century way of doing things that's very much embedded in this situation. And one of the things that makes it so typical is that Kamehameha starts out as a coup priest. So his job, he was a kahuna. His job was to do religious ceremonies to feed the mana to his half-brother, who was the political leader. So it looks very much, if you're all familiar with European history, it looks very much like the Catholic Church and the relationship with various rulers in Europe. The rulers did the secular stuff, but the Catholic Church provided the religious backdrop for that. So you go and pray in the church, and the guy or the cardinal who's head of the church goes and gives you the power and sanction of God, so you go out and do whatever. In Hawaii, the same thing happens by the 1700s. One group of the chiefs, one group of the ari'i become the political leaders, the secular leaders. Another group of the ari'i become the priest or kahuna. So your kahuna are part of the same group as these guys. And sometimes they work together, sometimes they're in opposition. The most famous would be, the name escapes me right now, but the famous seer, prophesier over on Oahu, who tells the high chief of Oahu, if you do what you're going to do, you're going to die. And the chief doesn't like it, so he kills him. It's important to remember both of those folks were actually of the ruling ranks. Neither of them were Makai and Anana. So when you're looking at the system, that's different sets of players. So when the Big Island chiefs under Kamehameha take over Maui, one of the first things you do is you wipe out the Maui chiefs, or you intermarry with the Maui chiefs. Two of his wives, for example, were Maui chieftesses from the senior lineage on the island of Maui. So you marry them into your family, you force them into your system. You then take, as I mentioned, some of these guys, and when you land here, you whack them. You then wipe out most of the Oahu chiefs or anyone who's any threat. And this is what was in store for Kauai if they'd managed to conquer it. So this is how you do business. And when you're done, you settle your followers and chiefs, your loyal backers from here, become the new guys that run the rest of the islands. So you have to remember, right into the 1850s, 1860s, if you're part of the older lineages, that older groups of chiefs from here, I suppose even Molokai, you're not going to see the monarchy as being your monarchy. You're going to see the monarchy as an imposition from a group of Big Island chiefs who basically got in a situation by virtue of talent and skill and took over the other places, but you're not necessarily going to see them as your folks. And so it's important to remember that a lot of the stuff that happens in the monarchy, you have to understand that the folks who were the Kamehamehas, and especially in the monarchy, were always very aware that they did not necessarily have the backing of a pretty significant portion of ari'i from the other islands. Because, if you're from Maui especially, but also Oahu, you were going to be in some cases pretty anti-monarchy because you wanted a rematch. Especially once Kamehameha dies and you realize that Liholiho and the other ones following him don't have the political military skills of the dad. So therefore, you think, well, this is time for round two and we're going to kick some ass and either we're going to be independent again or if we're really clever, maybe we can take the islands back. There were a whole series of revolts that occurred in the 1820s, and there were a few even in the 1830s, sponsored by chiefs, disaffected chiefs from other islands who wanted out of this system of the monarchy. So the idea that monarchy was sort of a natural evolution is not part of the reality of the system. And again, you have to remember, this is overlaid on a religion, which for these Western islands was probably pretty recent. So Hawaiian society, one of the main things I'm trying to get at with all this is that Hawaiian society was a very, very complicated scenario. It wasn't a very simple situation. It wasn't something, whoops, I lost it here. Hang on a second. It wasn't a situation where things had been the same and everything was the same, and all of a sudden, Captain Cook or someone shows up and bang, everything changes. It was an area where enormous amounts of change were taking place. And especially in the Middle and Eastern Islands, it must have been incredibly stressful. Because, I was figuring out once when we were talking, I was talking to some friends over in Maui, when we were figuring out that if you lived in Hana between 1760 and 1790, you were at war with the Big Island for all but like 4 years. So for a 30-year period, for 26 of those years, there was either constant warfare or guerrilla warfare or some type of warfare was going on, which meant if you left your house and went fishing, there's a good chance you were going to make it home. If you went somewhere to do some farming, you might come home and your house had been burned down. This is not a period of happy, warm, and fuzzies. This is a period where people were really stressing out. And to a certain extent, when this gets completely out of hand, especially under colonial Pu'u and Kahekili, I think to a certain extent, this might be why the monarchy becomes attractive, because at least you're stopping that. And you have to remember, even Kahekili, the chief on the island of Oahu, is a totally separate chief. Kahekili, while he's still having these fights with his colonial Pu'u counterpart from the Big Island, also invades Oahu and kicks the Oahu guy's ass and places his own guy in charge there. When that guy doesn't do what he wants to, he then comes back and reinvades Oahu and takes it over himself. So you find within the period of time just before Kamehameha, you end up with 3 different rulers of the island of Oahu, and 2 of them were not from Oahu; they were from Maui. At the same time, the parts of Maui are being taken over by from Big Island. You must need like a scorecard to figure out who's doing what to whom. And for the Makana, it was tremendously stressful, because not only is this happening to them, but they're the ones that are paying for this. They're the ones providing the food and the resources to make these wars happen. They're also the one that are providing most of the armies, because the armies were made up of commoners, controlled by chiefs. So you'd have units that were run by chiefs, and that was the wars. Now, it says something in a rather chilling way about the specialization, that one of the things that colonial Pu'u was famous for is he sets up specific groups of, basically they start out as boys. He starts picking men when they're about the age of 10, 11, or 12, takes them from the Makainana, puts them into units, and basically from that time till adulthood trains them as warriors. So they don't learn how to do much of anything else. They pretty much are brought up from kids as first child soldiers, then as adults. His most famous regiment is the one where they tattooed half their body black. That's the group that gets wiped out on East Maui. They got him so pissed off. So what you get is these guys are actually coming with warrior specialists. So you actually have pretty much full-time military units, especially on the Big Island, by the 1760s, 1770s. This is an enormous difference from the world prior to that. And that expansion doesn't happen in the rest of Polynesia. You don't see it even among the Maori who get really into warfare. That type of really heavy specialization, not only in military, but also in, for example, if you're a kahuna, they start specializing in very particular sets of skills. Some folks become Dunga kahuna who specialize in where you put things. In other words, like geomancy. Others become healing. Others become this, that, or the other things. You start to get this really heavy specialization all through the society. That is reflective of this 1700s process that takes place, that's tied in one way or another to this whole issue of warfare. So here's sort of a shopping list of the changes. Now, in a weird way, this actually worked, I don't know if I want to call it advantage, but what happens is that because this is all pretty much, when the dust is settled on Kamehameha's in charge in the late 1790s, what happens is this becomes entirely, in a sort of misunderstood way, but the Europeans see this, and the Europeans see Hawaii as then basically a monarchy. Now, it's important to understand that to the Europeans, the British, the French, the Russians, all the Europeans, Americans, this makes Hawaii a unique place in the Pacific. In the rest of the Pacific, even in large political regions like Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Maori never formed large political states under structured control. if you're someone coming in here from Boston, like the early missionaries in the 1820s, you're some trader coming here from New York in 1800, or you're some British whaler coming here in 1800. When you land in the Hawaiian Islands, once you figured out how the language works, you would have realized you had a king, you had guys in charge, you had people under them, you had a structured system, you had a group of enforcers, i.e. military, and you basically had all the appurtenances of European society that the Hawaiians had invented themselves. Now, what this means is when the Europeans are dealing with the Hawaiians, they can talk to one person. That one person can sign a treaty, that one person can do this, that one person can do that. So Hawaii, unlike anywhere else in the Pacific, gets treated as a semi-European country. And to a certain extent, if you're the Kamehamehas, this works to your advantage because the more everyone outside sees as the country, the more you can then sell that you have to run the country. So what you get is this very complex system that basically then pushes the development of the monarchy because it fits what the Europeans have expectations of sophisticated, semi-civilized people. And in this regard, they still see the rest of Polynesia as never having arrived there. So the rest of Polynesia becomes simpler, more Eden-like, less sophisticated, etc. This is one of the reasons you get the different European reactions to Tahiti and the Pomades versus a reaction to Hawaii and the Kamehamehas. Is that in Tahiti, like the rest of Polynesia, you don't get this idea of a political entity that provides real clear structured control. So therefore the Europeans sort of patronize and they see the Pomades as chiefs. Here, very quickly, the Europeans grab the Hawaiian word Ari'i and decide the guy that's the high Ari'i, Mogu or Mo, is actually the king. And of course, if you're part of the Hawaiian ruling elite, you see the European system and you think, oh, this is sort of like us. So both sides sort of make mistakes in assuming that there's more commonality than there probably actually was. But that's an important part because it explains why Hawaii gets treated and handled differently in the 19th century and why the monarchy becomes a fairly stable institution for almost the next 100 years is because of the fact that the Europeans saw the Hawaiians as building their own political state, which the Europeans then negotiate, interact with, and eventually, of course, try to modify and change and mess up. Let's see. I didn't really go ahead, I don't think. It's just a little bit. Okay, so let me start to finish up on this. I won't get it done, but we'll get some of this finished. First, is there any questions about that historical stuff until we get to monarchy? I went through it really fast. Okay. So if you're looking at all this, and I'm emphasizing the fact that you got this huge period of change, then what do you see persisting both throughout the historic period and depending on where you are, from place to place it varies, still exists here in Hawaii in the 21st century that you could call part of traditional Hawaiian values or traditional parts of traditional Hawaiian culture in terms of values and beliefs? Probably the key one, ironically, because this also both applies to the pre-Pa'ao period, but also during the Pa'ao period, is the importance of tradition. Referring to the past to justify what's done or to make sense of the present becomes not only a normal way, but it becomes, so stability becomes more important than change. Now, if you think about this, this is one of the things that makes Americans different than Europeans, I think I might have mentioned. Europeans are much more into tradition, but I think the folks that migrated to North America and set up the United States in the 1700s were folks that were really into change. And this becomes one of the manifestations of American sci-fi, both the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and it's an enormous amount of American rhetoric. Americans have a very unclear idea of what tradition means. You can see this in the current political discussions that are going on. And Americans are really fascinated with the idea of change. We always like new and improved or better. We don't like it when change screws up, like right now, but change, the idea that you're supposed to improve yourself. You're supposed to improve yourself as an individual. We're supposed to improve ourselves as a group, as a country. We're supposed to improve. Is this mantra to Americans, part of the American mantra, is the centrality of change. Hawaiian society was not based on change. Change was happening, obviously, in the 1600s, 1700s especially, but it wasn't something that people necessarily liked. Even your high chiefs, when Kamehameha comes to power, the first thing he does is he tries to basically ground himself and ground the system in tradition. So he didn't want to be seen as a bringer of change. He wanted to be seen as someone who was cleaning up a mess and bringing back good traditions. So going back, not so much going back to the past, but being grounded in the past, and being persistent in what was is what should be, is a really, really, really big thing still today with folks who are part of this Hawaiian value system. And you see this discussion going on all the time when it comes to controversies here. You know, with how people do stuff, where they do stuff, and you know, I mean, like I'm just thinking like 6 examples in the last couple of months. So this is still a huge difference between what you might call the Anglo system, or more accurately Anglo-American system, specifically American system, where change is good, and change by definition is better than standing still. Static has very few positive connotations in American society, versus Hawaiian society, where static and tradition are considered much more valuable. Change just because it's change is not seen as necessarily a good thing. The role of ancestors in relationship with clan has pretty much sort of been, for most folks, I don't think clan's really a super big thing. People tend to think of family now, which would be a subset. But depending on individuals and place, and this again varies very much from where you are, if you're part of the Hawaiian value system, ancestors can still be a big deal. Now, in some cases, the ancestors are now sort of vaguely people. So you get folks that, for example, from say, part of this island that are upset because Eve, or bones are recovered and they could be of our ancestors. There's not a clear link and there's no particular chant tied to that place or that person, but there's this idea of sort of ancestors in a more vague form compared to the old system where it's pretty clear. But the role of ancestors, or the past, people of the past who are still somehow tied into the present, is still a really big part of sort of the Hawaiian value system. And again, when you think about it, that's got very little to do with an Anglo system. Americans are not, I don't know that I've ever heard the word ancestor used in sort of Anglo-American society. Other groups, sure, you know, within minority groups in the American side, but I don't think Anglo-Americans could give an idea of who their ancestors are. They might have a family tree, but I doubt if most people could ever recite past their grandparents in it. So the idea of ancestors in the group is not a strong one. Huge point of difference. One of the really intriguing ones, it's been a source of huge confusion with me, because I happen to be a huge fan of sweet potato, is if you look at the early accounts. In fact, there's a really good book by Handy that was done in the 1930s about Hawaiian. It's called Hawaiian Planters, which deals with Hawaiian agriculture. Is that, for example, there are over 100 different varieties of sweet potato and about 250 different varieties of dalo. So what you find is that sweet potato was actually what commoners ate. Many commoners, we now figure, very rarely ate dalo. Dalo becomes the prerogative of the chiefs in this, you know, pa'ao thing. So chiefs ate dalo, commoners ate sweet potato. Chiefs would occasionally eat sweet potato, but it wasn't what they normally ate. So what you might call the junk normal food is the sweet potato. If you're somebody, you get dalo. So in this system, what you find is that's when you move into the 19th century, move into the monarchy, the population shrinks due to disease and all sorts of other factors. What you find is now, because they can afford it or they want it, is the sweet potato pretty much becomes a disaster food. And status and prestige means that dalo now becomes the food. To the extent that for some folks today, they pretty much, you know, have this perception that dalo is the Hawaiian food, which is sort of interesting, because I went back 200 years, they would have found a large part of the population is eating nuala instead of dalo. They would eat dalo if they could get it. But if you're a commoner eating dalo, you had to be pretty careful, because if you were in an area like, say, Palolo, I can guarantee that almost all the dalo production in Palolo was for the chiefs that lived down Waititi side. So if you were found one afternoon, you know, knocking off a bowl of poi, and you were a commoner, and the local land manager, the Konahiki, comes by and sees you eating that, you could find yourself in the hell being sacrificed, because that dalo is the prerogative of people who were different. The Ariki, they were not the prerogative of commoners unless the chiefs give you say, hey, you can have a bowl of this. So not surprisingly, when the system starts to collapse and stuff becomes more available, then immediately people jump on these status stuff. So if you want to think of the closest American counterpart, I think would be hamburger and steak. So having said that, you can actually prepare sweet potato in a whole mess of ways. You very rarely see lomi de poi. Though we do eat that occasionally over in East Maui, and I still like it. In some ways, well, anyways, I'll get into that. Anyways, one of these differences. So the idea of these starches being part of the value system or identity system of the group is still there, though they've changed in terms of the relative proportion. One of the more intriguing ones that you don't hear a lot talked about, I'm not particularly sure why. Let's see. Well, actually, let me go. I'll start that next time with that one. I got to make a mark to myself. But let me just finish off with this really quickly. This idea of mana. What you find is mana, as I mentioned, becomes the logic of the Odo religion. The function of chiefs was to generate and absorb and dispense mana, and that's the reason that they're different. That's the reason they're special. And then the rules of kapu become the rules and regulations to basically protect and enforce both the social system and the chief's control of mana. Now that's changed a lot, and especially, if you get sort of the local concept, mana turns into sort of like a vague thing which is used for everyone. At UH games where they take tea leaves and wave it to generate mana to make the team win. And then this whole idea of kapu becomes, don't kapu my pin. So they've become part of the modern words, but they're not the same logic. Having said that, if you're dealing with folks who are still part of this traditional value system, you still find both of these concepts are pretty strong. In fact, they're quite strong in a lot of areas. There's places where you cannot go. Those areas are considered kapu. And those rules, in some cases, at least in East Maui, I know those rules have been there for about 200 years at least. So those are old rules which are still here, and people still see them pretty much the same way. In many ways, when you're watching folks, especially folks that are dealing with traditional activities, whether it be agriculture or fishing, I'm not talking about long line fishing off a boat, I'm talking about people shore fishing or diving especially, or throwing net. You're going to find a lot of the concepts of mana in terms of what you catch in a net, for example, where you throw the net, what you do with the catch that you get out of the net. It's still really traditional. So a lot of the concepts of mana and kapu, depending on where you are and what you're involved in, are still pretty strong. And it's still pretty traditional in the sense that they still follow that traditional logic. So that'll stop because this one's going to be a little bit trickier. So I'll get into that next time. I got to write a note to myself. So I guess with that, any questions or comments or queries or anything? Everyone's being suspiciously silent today.
No.
Thank you. A voice from the wilderness, and a little digital wilderness. I can see these little rectangles on my screen. Does it all sort of make sense to you guys? I'm going through. Okay. When you're reading Tanya, make a little more sense. And this hopefully it puts some of that in the context. So if there's no questions, I guess.
I should have asked them about my critical thinking paper. I didn't turn in.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I had a question, but I think I'll be okay for now. Thank you.
You sure you don't want to ask it?
Yes, because I was looking at I reread the syllabus last night, and then I was just like, oh, okay, never mind. But I was gonna ask again this morning, and then I just decided that it was fine. But thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No. I mean, yeah, don't ever be afraid to ask the question, because I can guarantee if it didn't make sense, you weren't too sure what it was supposed to be, I can guarantee half of the group probably had the same question or thought about it. So.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, I guess if there's nothing, then I guess we'll call a halt then. Is that, you guys all set to go?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, shoots.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, in that regard, so I'll see you guys on, it's Tuesday, huh? Yeah, it must be. Okay, so I'll see you guys on Thursday. So see you later.
See ya.
Bye.